welcome everyone. It is Tuesday, January 4th, 2022, and this is our next meeting of the ARPA, American Rescue Plan Act Committee, which has the purpose of helping the town decide how to spend the funds that we have received through that legislation. So I appreciate everybody joining the call today. Monica had wanted to join the call, but she's unavailable, but she will join at our next meeting. So just to note that. What I wanted to do to start things off is that we are graciously joined today by Mike Muzinski. I think hopefully I got your last name pronounced right. With a last name like Zagrodzki, I can't screw up Polish names. So we appreciate that. Mike is from CCM, and he's been very involved in ARPA for quite some time, as I understand it, and is very familiar with both the rules as well as hopefully how other towns are thinking about both how to spend the money as well as the process for doing so. So he has graciously agreed to join us for the first bit of this meeting, maybe give us a quick overview of how he sees things in terms of what we can and can't do, which I think we're familiar with at a high level. And then if he's got any suggestions for us in terms of our process or around best practice for whatever he sees other towns doing in Connecticut to make smart decisions on this, we'd love to hear from him. But Mike, we really appreciate you spending a few minutes with us. So thanks a lot for joining. I will hand the microphone to you.
Yeah, thank you, John, for that warm introduction. I appreciate the opportunity to be invited. I certainly try and join as many of these as I can that my schedule will allow. And I've done quite a few of these, whether it's high level details or very intricate formal presentations. I certainly look forward to providing the insight that I've gained over the past year and following this, even before it became the formal act that was passed by Congress, but even working in some of the nuances with the National League of Cities and our congressional delegation on some of the specifics that ultimately became the new law. I'm not sure in particular where your areas of focus have been or what involvement the group has done thus far on some of these initiatives, but I guess what I'll do is I'll just provide just some overview points that I've spoken about in the past, I think, to kind of give a good perspective as far as where a lot of communities are, and then some best practices. And then certainly, if there's an opportunity to answer any of your questions, I'll be happy to do so. So as you all are very familiar, the American Rescue Plan is an extremely unique program for mainly two reasons. The first of which is it's a significant amount of money, probably the largest one tranche of federal funds that the municipality is ever going to be receiving. And then secondly, the distribution of it is very unique, where it was an automatic allocation. You didn't have to apply for it. And this, while it's great, you don't necessarily need to you have a little bit more flexibility. It does impose a burden on the municipality to ensure that you are in compliance with the rules and eligible uses, and that you report accordingly to the rules. So it's unique in those two aspects. And as you all are familiar, you're guided right now by the Treasury's interim final rule. The final rule has not yet been released. We're anticipating, I anticipated it was going to be before the end of 2021. That obviously did not occur. We're hopeful in the next month or so that report will be issued. But along with that report, if you had the opportunity to review it, it's incredibly comprehensive, but it's very ambiguous in a lot of areas. It includes a non-exclusive list of eligible areas. It includes those prohibited uses, as well as some encouraged uses. There are some documents that certainly help to break down some of that. So Treasury has two documents that are regularly updated. If you look on their website, one of which is the Treasury FAQ document, which kind of breaks down the rules, answer some of the questions that they've heard from states and municipalities. And then there is a compliance and reporting document. And that is actually segregated into whether you are a non-entitlement unit of government or a metropolitan unit. So for your purposes, you just need to worry about the NEU reporting requirements. And I'll touch on that in just a second. So as I mentioned, the rule has a non-exclusive list of eligible uses, which again is great, but because it's non-exclusive, you can certainly have other eligible areas that aren't necessarily defined within the rule. What you need to do to ensure that you're in compliance is you need to, whatever you're trying to use some of the funding towards, you need to determine that the harm that you're trying to rectify with these funds was caused by COVID. So whenever you're looking at funding a particular program, if it's not exclusively listed in a Treasury document, you just need to ensure that there's a nexus between the harmful impact that was caused by COVID and what you're trying to fund, and how that funding will alleviate that harm or address that harm. You don't need to necessarily alleviate it completely, but at least address that harm. Those prohibited items, you probably are all familiar. You can't use it to fund pensions. You can't use it to fund your reserve funds. You can't use it for legal settlements. And those are well articulated throughout the rule in various sections. There's various categories that the interim rule is broken out into, and the act itself, really. Some say you'll hear different types of categories, but they're pretty much all the same. Some people say that there's 4 general categories. Some people say that there's 7. I'm just going to refer to kind of the first 4, the big ones. Addressing the public health emergency. So those would be efforts to address the needs, the public health needs right now associated with COVID. So these are needs that are prospective in nature, that you can't use them to reimburse for previous expenses. So they can be vaccination incentives, quarantine cost mitigation strategies. So if you're outfitting a particular municipal building to ensure social distancing, increasing air quality, improving air quality within congregate settings, those are eligible expenses. You can also use it in this category for behavioral health. That's certainly an eligible use. The next category would be addressing the negative impacts caused by COVID. And this is probably the more broader interpreted areas that probably has the most questions. What I've encouraged municipalities to look at it in this respect, look at it from economic recovery perspective rather than economic development. I know some communities have looked at using some of these funds toward developing downtown or developing certain areas within their town based on existing economic development plans. To ensure you're in compliance, you really need to look at it from a recovery aspect. Again, going back to that nexus with COVID, what type of economic harm was caused by COVID, and how will these funds address that harm? So you can use it to help businesses, nonprofits, other community groups that have been economically harmed by COVID. If you're looking for an example as far as a loan or a grant program to assist businesses and nonprofits, the town of East Windsor has a great program. They're actually in the implementation stages right now. If you look on their website, all the information is there from their initial application to their final report. It's called the ERASE grant. I forgot what the acronym stands for, I apologize, but it details very well. They allocated a good portion of their funding to assist local businesses, nonprofits, and that final report really details how the businesses will use some of those funds and how they were impacted negatively by COVID. You can use it within this category for tourism, hospitality initiatives, make improvements in parks, whether it's a Parks and Rec program, or make improvements in your various facilities. The important part of this, again, trying to ensure that there's that nexus between your funding and COVID. You need to ensure that if you're making an improvement to an existing facility or program, that that improvement was delayed because of COVID, or you need to make improvements because there are a variety of areas where parks were overused during the pandemic. People tried to be outside more. So if parks or facilities or resources were overused during the pandemic, those are eligible expenses within that economic recovery, parks and rec, park improvement subcategories. Another category is infrastructure, in particular, water, sewer, broadband. So generally speaking, what the Treasury rule, and you're probably familiar with this, is Treasury basically said, we're not going to try and define what water, sewer, and projects are eligible. You have to refer to the EPA's two programs, one on drinking water and one on clean water. So they basically said if you're funding a program that would fit into those programs, they would be eligible expenses. Under broadband, it's probably more narrowly focused than we would have liked, where you need to make investments to assist businesses and residents that don't have 25 megabytes per second upload download speed, I believe. So it's very it's a lower standard, but I believe most communities already have this. For most businesses and residents already meet this standard. So until Treasury makes any sort of adjustments, we haven't heard of a lot of communities making any appropriations underneath the broadband category because of this 25 megabytes stipulation. The other question that we've certainly gotten, and that raises a lot of questions, is you can use the money to offset any sort of revenue loss. Now, if you've taken a look at the Treasury's interim rule, there is a formula that you can use to determine revenue loss. GFOA, the Government Finance Officers Association, has an Excel sheet, it's a calculator that you can use to put in certain numbers to determine what type of revenue loss has been experienced. It's important to note that when you look at revenue loss, you have to look at it in the aggregate. You can't go line item by line item. Certainly during the pandemic, certain areas experienced significant revenue loss where others were pretty much stable. You need to look at it holistically, and the calculator and the formula really spells a lot of this out. I will say that a lot of communities, surprisingly, have experienced some sort of revenue loss based on that formula because it is somewhat lucrative for Connecticut municipalities. So even though you think you might not have any sort of revenue loss based on the formula, you certainly might. And I would encourage you to do that, because if you do find that your community has experienced revenue loss, what you're able to use that delta for, those funds for, is any sort of government service. So while most of the rule stipulates you can only use it in certain categories, this funding, if you determine revenue loss, can be used towards any government service, which we've interpreted it to mean anything that a municipality would typically budget for. So that gives a lot more latitude. The caveat being you can't use it towards any prohibited item. So you can't use it towards pension and all the things that I had mentioned before. But it gives, again, a greater latitude on what you can use it for. Another area of eligible use is administrative costs. So you can certainly use it, use some of these funds if you need to hire certain individuals or use existing staff to administer the ARP grants or program. You need to utilize them as a project manager or utilize them as a grants facilitator if you're going to be making grants to businesses and residents and nonprofits. You can certainly use some of the costs to offset any sort of administrative costs that are associated with this program. Reporting is going to be crucial for all of this. As I mentioned before, one of the unique parts of the whole program is that it's going to be the responsibility of each municipality to ensure that you're in compliance through your reporting. So you need to make sure that internal control mechanisms are in place within your community. For the smaller municipalities like yours, the NEUs, you only need to complete an annual report that is due April 30th of each year, which is great. It'll be through a portal that Treasury will be opening up in the very near future. I believe actually some of it might be open now. As an organization like CCM, I certainly don't have access to it. So I know I've gotten a couple of questions as far as how to manipulate the program. I don't have access because we aren't a recipient of any of those funds. We are working with Treasury, and I know Treasury is working on developing a webinar to assist in the logistics on how you need to be submitting some of those reports. But generally, and I'd refer you to the compliance and reporting document on the Treasury's website, when you do these reports that's due annually by April 30th, what you need to do is every sort of allocation that you're going to be making, you need to appropriate it to one of those categories. And in that reporting document, that's where it lists out the 7 different categories. So public health, addressing economic impacts caused by COVID, et cetera. You need to define one of those categories. You need to provide a description, 50 to 250 words as far as what the project is, what you plan on doing with it. This is really, you need to, again, I would recommend correlate it strongly to a harmful impact that was caused by COVID. And then you need to do typical administration grants, provide the typical information that you would do when you administer grants. So you need to provide them the cost, the time period, status, as it's going to be an annual report. You're going to have to provide annual updates as far as whether it's pending, completed, whatnot. And then any subrecipients that you plan to use, that you plan to appropriate any of these funds towards. It's important to know that if you appropriate any of your funds to a subrecipient, so if you have a grant program to assist local businesses, for example, and you appropriate X amount to 20 different businesses, they are considered subrecipients, but you are still, as the municipality, responsible for the reporting of the funding. So this is really where it comes into, and we can share best practices, again, from East Windsor and others, where memorandum of understanding or some sort of affidavit needs to be signed by the business that you're contracting with to ensure that they're following the eligible rules, that they're attesting to the fact that they're using it appropriately, and they will submit any sort of required documentation to you that you'll be able to submit to Treasury. And just finally, just some best practices. Again, one of the biggest things, internal control mechanisms, make sure that the administration of the program is really tight and well controlled. Utilize us and Treasury and others as resources. So as I mentioned before, Treasury has a variety of documents that are updated routinely. We have a CCM toolkit. We have a variety of other resources that are available on our website or we've distributed via email. Certainly utilize us as a resource. I'm always willing to meet with groups again, even though we're only going to be meeting for a short period today. Be happy to meet again in the future. Other best practices, adhere to the rules that Treasury is given, but also ensure that you're adhering to local regulations, state laws, state and federal regulations. That's going to be important. So if you undergo, for instance, certain types of programs where there might be labor issues, make sure you're in compliance with those. Or if you're going to be undergoing infrastructure investments, make sure that you adhere to any sort of DEEP or DPH regulations that you might have to, that might be required for that particular program. I think one of the best things that I certainly recommend to all towns is convene all stakeholders, which I think you all are doing right now, is convene a group of individuals that can think holistically, that have the insight from a variety of different perspectives and can provide a unique sounding board for the community as a whole to ensure that the funds are appropriately allocated. Be transparent. So whatever plan you do come up with, make sure you're, even though it's not required, ensure that you have it well documented and the public is aware of where you're going to be allocating these funds. Again, it's a significant amount of money. You don't want to be in a situation where there's going to be questions, whether in the near term or in the long-term future. Use existing resources. So there's a number of groups that are out there. We've certainly advise communities to utilize nonprofits, businesses, chambers of commerce to not only be a resource for some of the information, but also be a conduit for maybe getting some of the money out to serve the community. So I know a number of communities are working with nonprofits to assist certain homeowners or businesses in particular ways. So basically don't reinvent the wheel, see what's already out there, use existing delivery channels for those efforts. And if they are internal or possibly regional. So I know one of the big things that we've encouraged communities to look at is look at your councils of government, look at other regional programs or initiatives. You can pool these funds with other communities and allocate them towards regional initiatives that will serve the best interests of your community. So those are just some things that we have encouraged communities to do. We have a ARP Advisory Service Committee, which comprises of policy leaders in a variety of different areas that we meet on a monthly basis, that comes up with best practices and resources for our members, and we continue to provide updates to our members routinely. But again, it's an inundating process and program. There's a lot of question marks in a lot of areas. It's ambiguous when you really look at it, but I have myself, as well as speaking to a lot of other local officials, when you spend enough time digesting some of the information, there is a level of comfort that comes with making sure that you're appropriating the funds in an appropriate manner. So with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Mike, that was extremely helpful. We really appreciate it. Does anybody have any questions for Mike? Dan?
John, I have a question. Yeah. Hey, so thank you, Mike. I have a question regarding infrastructure, specifically water. What I think I just heard was that a permitted use would be to address drinking water / clean water. The toolkit that was circulated back in October had a much broader application or definition of permitted water related uses. It included stormwater treatment, wastewater treatment, green infrastructure, creation of green infrastructure. It seemed to be a much broader set of categories rather than just enhancing, drinking water. Or is that an evolution in either an interpretation, or is that an evolution of what we're learning about what's coming out of Washington?
No. So that's a good point, and I apologize. I think I might not have been clear. What I was referring to is the rule, the Treasury's rule, referred to the EPA's programs, the EPA's Clean Water Revolving Loan Fund and the EPA's Drinking Water Revolving Loan Fund. And within those categories are those eligible uses that you just mentioned. So
right,
that's still in existence. Those are still eligible uses. Those are examples. They just happen to have that broad definition of clean water, drinking water subcategories. So I apologize if I confused you, but those are still eligible use categories. But if you have a particular infrastructure project that you're looking at, I would encourage you to look at the two EPA sites. If you just, I believe that the link is provided in that toolkit, or if you just do a Google search, EPA's Drinking Water Revolving Loan Fund, they will actually specify each of the projects, and you can really define whether it's eligible or not.
Thank you.
Francis?
My question is, can we use some of these funds for studies that might lead to projects or might not lead to projects that would be qualifying?
So some of the eligible uses do allow you to develop certain studies or data metrics to ensure that you're appropriating the money effectively. But what it does require is, if you do engage in some of that, and it's not eligible, it's not in all categories, it's only certain categories. If you do engage in that, you better be appropriating the money in that category. So if you do want to go down that road of studying something, Treasury is going to look for you to use the funds to actually implement whatever you come up with. So it might be, depending on the area, it might, most communities are looking at it just within that infrastructure category, because it does, that is probably a very costly endeavor when you have to develop those plans and initiatives. But if you just want to come up with a study to determine the negative economic impacts that were caused by COVID in your community, that may be questionable.
Thank you.
Terrific. Other questions, Martha?
Yeah, on the using money to offset loss, you can use it for anything a government would typically budget for. Would that include capital projects?
Yes. Yep. That's what we're interpreted to mean right now. Again, the final rule may narrow that definition. I doubt it. I think what we're going to be expecting in the final rule is a little bit more clarity. I don't think they're going to narrow anything, but communities now are under the understanding that government services would be services as well as any sort of capital improvements.
Terrific. Other questions for Mike?
Hi, this is Carla. Yeah, my question is on the,
You just went on mute.
You've muted yourself, Carla. Unmute yourself.
No, John, did you want to allow public comment? Carla's not a
Oh.
member of the committee.
Thank you. Sure, we got a minute, but Carla, go ahead. Can you unmute her, Kate, or?
I'm asking her to unmute.
okay,
Carla, start
Yes.
over, Carla, go ahead.
okay. The problem with flooding and infrastructure, Darien has had multiple areas of flooding, people losing their homes. Would this be included in the funds directed to Darien?
So you'd really have to look again back at the EPA's, probably would fall underneath the Clean Water Revolving Loan Fund program. I don't know if flooding is part of that or the mitigation. I believe some stormwater is included, so it really depends. Another area that I would encourage communities to examine is, there are certainly a number of other funding opportunities. So even if you, during this process, identify areas that may be ineligible, and I'll be happy to share it with you, John, in the group. There are a number of other funding resources that are available. So in regards to flooding, there are FEMA grants that are available. Certainly FEMA has a lot of strings that are attached to their funding initiatives, but if something isn't allowed underneath this program, there may be other opportunities that you can look at.
Okay, other questions for Mike? Terrific. We'll let you go, Mike. Give you back the rest of your day. But again, we really appreciate your input, and I am sure I will be calling on you and your colleagues at some point as we march through all this. But thank you very much.
Not a problem. Happy to be here.
All right, take care.
Bye.
Okay. What I would thought we could do for the rest of our agenda is touching on the note that I sent out to everybody, was to think about a work plan so that we can get started on some of this. And as I mentioned in my 3 dot points there about the work plan that we might follow at a high level, it strikes me that there ought to be a period of time where we go through an idea generation process where we cast a wide net and see how many different ideas that we could come up with. Again, hopefully they're all fairly reasonable. I think once we have a collection of ideas, we probably need to assess them, screen them, and then prioritize them, since we can't do everything. And that screening is going to come with a sense of what those ideas would cost, because obviously we have a budget. And then finally, to come up with a recommendation that we would give to the Board of Selectmen for their consideration so that they could start the process for actually spending this money. So that was what I was thinking about at a high level. I'll open up to questions in a minute. If we agree to that, it seems to me that for idea generation, it might make sense to have a few committees and maybe aligning them with the permitted funds based on some emails I've received from some of you, as well as this discussion today. It seems like the categories that would make most sense for us would be infrastructure, health-related costs, addressing negative economic impact, and then maybe even a compensation for essential public workers. But let me stop there and see if anybody has any reactions, both to the overall work plan that I articulated, as well as maybe the idea of some committees to go off and think about idea generation, to maybe come back and report to this group for consideration. What do you think? Well, I think it's a fabulous idea.
I think those are good categories.
Okay.
And one comment I would make is that anything we might want to do with the use of the lost revenue could fall into any of those categories. So I do know, there has been some push for things related to our parks, which were heavily used during the pandemic, though I'm not sure that there's any damage that needs to be addressed. But that would be the one thing we would want to keep in mind, possibly, that that could fall under the lost revenue replacement.
Okay. All right. So that
Hey,
sounds.
John,
Dan, go
I'm
ahead.
sorry, one other question.
Sure.
Did we have lost compensation for public workers? Did our town employees lose any compensation as a result of COVID? Because I'm not aware that happened, and if that did happen, of course, something we should look at pretty seriously. But I'm not aware that did occur.
Kate?
They did not lose any revenue. They did not lose any income. We even at times where we had employees not working, we paid them. We also did factor into their wage increases that went into place July 21, what work they had done during the pandemic, and not monetary, but we also provided additional paid time off for employees, again, based on the work done during the pandemic. So for example, somebody who was here every day, never out, they both got monetary compensation, and well, for non-reps, they got monetary compensation, and other people got additional paid time off.
So it sounds like we're okay there.
I think we are, honestly, but that's not for me to make that decision.
Okay. All right. So again, we need to generate ideas, and maybe having a few of us go off and work in small groups to think about what ideas could fit up against these various categories that the ARPA legislation has specified. Again, as I said, infrastructure, health-related costs, and then maybe just a third group. There aren't that many people on this committee that would be kind of all other, but it strikes me that the health-related costs and infrastructure are going to be big enough that maybe having some sort of separate groups to go off and think about that would be a good idea. Does that seem to make sense as sort of a starting point? We certainly can revise that. So Dan, you mentioned before an interest in water infrastructure, and even asked a question on this. Maybe the infrastructure group could be something that you could take on in terms of idea generation. We'll talk more about that process in a minute, but does that sound like something you'd like to spend time on?
Yes.
Okay.
Hey, John, in terms of public health response, I'm happy to take that up with David, Mark, and I think Allie. We're gonna have a lot of we work a lot on this together anyway.
Okay.
There's probably a natural synergy there.
All right, great. So Dan for
If that works.
infrastructure,
Martha
Kevin,
too.
Kevin for health related, Martha.
Yeah, I had indicated to you, I also would like to work on infrastructure.
Terrific. I will pair you up with Dan. You guys can work on that.
And Ed,
And plus Ed, great.
That goes without saying.
No, don't worry, Ed. We got your phone number. Okay, and then so Kevin with the health related efforts, and obviously I guess David, you'd be on there as well. Who else to work with, Kevin? Kevin?
I'd be happy to do it.
All right, Frank and Bill.
John, I think there's an obvious synergy with Allie's group too, Allie, if that's all right with you, and certainly Mark on the response piece.
Okay.
John, I think we should try and leverage Bill's relationship with his fellow business owners to get more information on the economic impacts that our businesses may have had.
Yeah,
Some of it we may not be able to do anything about because the actions that they took prior to March of 2021, we can't. But if there are things that we can address going forward to assist them, that would come under the all other category you have?
Bill,
I'm
what do you
going to
think?
go out on a limb and kind of suspect that there was very little economic long run impact. There certainly was in 2020 for a lot of businesses. And I'm going to say that most recovered very quickly, that most used available funds through PPP or loans or grants. It'd be interesting if we could somehow get a survey of how bad was it really in 2021. I see some businesses right now that have shorter hours because they cannot get staff. So there might be something worth exploring. The biggest thing I hear from customers and a lot of colleagues is really the mental health issue, not only for parents, but also for kids from, you name it, kindergarten through high school and college kids who are having all sorts of problems. And the same with parents, where all of a sudden we've lived under the same roof for a long, long time, but we really haven't lived under the same roof for 24 hours a day for 6 months. And the mental health or the issues that are resulting from that appear to be very, very serious. And it's impacting kids, and you see it at the schools, and you see it in the lack of sharing. So if I were to choose the priorities, mental health would be my number one over the impact that it has on the toy store, if you will.
Okay.
All right. So I think we got maybe just a third catch-all bucket that will include things like negative economic impact, to Bill's good point, mental health. It's a very serious problem. But maybe that would be sort of a catch-all that would cover all these other potential.
Yeah, John, let me run something by the chamber, see if we can have a very simple survey of feedback from the businesses, see what they have to say about the impact of yes, no, percentage wise, something very simple. I'll come up with something and run it by you guys.
A great idea. If I can help you, Bill, that'd be great. Let me know. Terrific. All right. Well, what I'll do is maybe I'll fill in for this sort of catch-all bucket and see about coordinating other members of the group. Kate.
I'll work on the catch-all.
Kate is going to help me. She's a catch-all kind of person. So I think that kind of fills out those three committees. What I would encourage is maybe for each of the three groups to touch base separately offline and talk a little bit about idea generation. And that's what I want to kind of close on right now, which is what's the best way to do that? I think Bill's survey with the chamber to see what businesses think is a great idea. Other things are simply getting input from the public in either a free form way through, say, an email that we could set up that people could reach out to that would copy the rest of us if people have suggestions. One idea that's been suggested has been to have a public hearing where folks could actually show up at the hearing and offer their ideas. Or we could actually just go off and think up ideas on our own and put them out for reaction, either through meetings like this or articles in the paper or posting them to the town website, or maybe some combination of all of those. But if you had to think about good ways to just surface ideas that we could consider, does anybody have any suggestions, or have you given any of that thought? Dan?
Yeah, John, one thing that I think Mike could be very helpful at is giving us examples of what other towns have either done or are considering and have advanced along like this East Windsor thing. It may not be exactly where we want to prioritize, but it would certainly be an idea for negative economic impact, what they have, it appears to put in place.
It's a great question. I had it on my mind, but we had already used up a lot of his time. So I'll drop him a separate email. In fact, I'll copy you on it, Dan, and let's just see what he says about that. So.
Great.
Could I also suggest evictions if now that the moratorium, I think we've mentioned this before, but now that the moratorium has been lifted quite a few months now, we're anticipate that there will be an increase in evictions. We have no idea what to expect, but that certainly would be good use of the money if it's COVID related, obviously.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. I would have to go down, take a careful look at this idea of individual relief, right? And helping individuals or families that are in distress, and think about, excuse me, think about what the rules are for that, but that's a great suggestion. What else?
Well, I think it goes without saying that we pair off, we certainly include the town officials that are heading up these respective areas. So Ed, obviously for infrastructure, and if there are natural point people for either the larger kind of subheadings or subgroups of those subheadings, I think that goes without saying that would be an integral partner as we flesh this out.
Yeah, that's
Well,
a great
Dan, I think
idea.
you've got all the people for your group.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dan, you tagged them pretty good. Maybe Kate and I, we need some minutes from this meeting in any case. Kate, maybe we could touch base for a few minutes today or tomorrow and sort of think about that and who could help with these individual groups. But
Yep.
that's a great suggestion because all the town staff, they're going to be experts on where funding could be spent to help the town.
And I would say, keep in mind that the decisions you make in the initial, they don't have to be permanent. So, say we set aside money for evictions. If we get down the road and we find that we set aside too much, you can go back and reappropriate. We wouldn't have to follow the process, but don't feel like you have to get it perfect the first time.
Sorry, just one other idea is Janet King at the Community Fund, because they're day to day among the world of the nonprofits addressing certainly in the health related and maybe even the negative economic impact related, whether it's food security or whatever it might be. I would think that they're probably 36 or so agencies. The feedback they get from those agencies could be very informative as to kind of what's impacting our community day to day.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, even more broadly. And I'll admit I've not thought about this since she suggested it, but last fall, Jamie Stevenson had wondered whether some or the preponderance of these funds could actually be donated to other towns that were in greater need than ours. It's certainly, I think, permissible under the rules to do that, but we might actually consider some notion of charity as part of this. And by that, I mean not charity within our town, but charity to other towns or even nonprofits that are focused on some of these things. So more to come on that. Okay. That was all I had on my list. Again, this is really more of a formal kickoff meeting now that we have everybody on the phone, and also a chance to kind of kickstart things in terms of idea generation. That was my main objective today. Like I said, Kate and I will collaborate, get a couple of quick notes out on this, and see about just articulating the game plan, but in writing so that everybody can take a look at it. The last thing I think we need to do is set up our next meeting, and I wanted to get a sense for what everybody thought about that. I would like to keep this moving along. So today is Tuesday the 4th, and it strikes me that trying to have something, say, at least every couple of weeks to keep things moving. I don't know, anybody have any suggestions? Kate, what do you think?
I think that's great. Keep moving along.
Okay. Would this same day, 2 weeks from now, the 18th, right after MLK at 1 o'clock with a Zoom setup, does that work for everybody? Kevin's good?
Yes.
Okay. Yep, good. All right, terrific. I'll get Linda or Karen to send out another meeting invite so that we can pop that on everybody's calendar. But in the note that we'll send out after this, I'll just encourage our committee chairs to get started on idea generation. And what I'd like to do at the next meeting is both pressure test our process, make sure that's working, and see what everybody's thinking and what they're hearing. I would further encourage you to do as much ad hoc idea generation as you can. Talk to friends, talk to people you know. We're all involved in town governments. We know a lot of people. Ask folks what they think about some of this and cast a wide net, and let's see what we come up with. In the meantime, we'll get this note out. It was a great idea for me to pop another note to Mike to see what other towns are doing in terms of idea generation. Plagiarism is terrible in high school and college. Plagiarism is fantastic when you're an adult in something like this. So I would encourage extreme plagiarism. If somebody else is doing a good job with ideas or deploying these funds, we want to copy them shamelessly. So, okay. All right. Anything else for the good of the order today? Okay. Can I get a motion to adjourn? Francis, Dan, second. All in favor? We are adjourned. Thank you, friends. We'll see you in a couple of weeks.